Yeah. No, I took my quarter zip out of my backpack.
Imagine.
It looked like mine for a second.
Well, this one.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, I'm going to get it. So I was gonna go put it on.
No, it's the one I want. That eagle on the in that.
Well, you go to the full target yells.
Is he really pure at we should do it that way. Yeah, it's good at that. Like, practically about your things. It's pure. I was thinking chip on the first. That's fine. You understand it's different. Don't show my iPad. No, this is bigger.
All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today?
Pretty tired. Good.
Tired? Yeah. Everyone have a good weekend?
Pretty good.
I was at a wedding this past weekend for 2 friends from high school. It was interesting because they weren't friends really in high school, but they reunited at our 10-year reunion, and so it happened right before COVID. So they reunited, realized that they liked each other, fell in love, and then now they got married this past year, which is funny. And so at their wedding, it was funny because we had 2 different kind of groups of people from this high school that normally wouldn't talk to each other, but we're there celebrating the same wedding, and so. So a lot of people I haven't talked to in a long time, but we're all adults at this point, so it was really nice to catch up. Yeah. It's the year of weddings, so I know probably a couple of students that are going to weddings this week. And then probably you guys know I'm planning my own wedding for too. I waited until after the semester, basically right after the last week of classes to have my wedding, just so wouldn't interfere with that. But I'm also doing you guys a favor because after I go to weddings, I'm always in a really good mood. And so after I have my own wedding, I'm gonna be really happy. So when I'm grading all you guys' final project, I'm gonna be in a really good mood. Did you doing you guys a solid? Okay. Plan for this week. Okay, so this week we're starting off talking about the different parts of the body. And so we're going kind of more in detail about the biomechanics of the different inputs. And so we've just kind of finished reviewing basic mechanics. We've gone over how to do kind of just basic static calculations, free body diagrams, force balance, and moment balances. So now we're going to start applying that. And so, I think so starting this week, and then we're going to be doing this for the next 3 weeks. I think this is probably one of my favorite parts of the class because up until this point we've been kind of just been doing all this prep and review. It's been not the most exciting stuff, but now you actually get to see a lot of what we learned be applied. So what we learned about muscles, joints, mechanics, it all kind of comes together for the fitness and stuff. Hope you guys enjoy the next 3 weeks. And so we're starting with the upper extremity, and so that involves your arms, your shoulders, your chest, a little bit of your upper back as well. And so we'll talk about just the general characteristics of this area, which is some calculations. We'll talk about common injury, kind of just go over all of it. Okay. I think that's about it. I don't have anything else to say. Are there any other questions I can answer before we get started? Okay. All right. So we're going to start with the slides, and so we'll go back to the iPad later once we're doing calculations. But I think the slides are kind of nice for showing kind of images and go over kind of conceptual. Okay. So up until this point, like I mentioned, we've been going over just the biomechanics of the different tissues in the body in general: bones, muscles, joints. Yes, it's recording. Yes. And so now that we have this knowledge, we can really start to apply this to the different parts of the body. Okay. And so we're kind of well equipped now to take a look at the structure and the size of the different bones and the joints and muscles, as well as look at typical loads, typical situations that arises, and kind of link this to things like injury mechanics, things like designing devices for these areas, which could be muscle forces, joint loads, all things like that. Okay, and so we're starting with the upper extremity, and so the image that I have here is of this gentleman throwing a baseball. Okay, and what the upper extremity is mostly used for is that it's what I like to say, it's kind of our interface to how we handle the world. And so a lot of things that we do, they usually involve our hands, our arms, our shoulders, things like that. Okay, and so the upper extremity has a lot of I would say flexibility in terms of what it can do. And it can do a lot of very fine movements as well. All right, and so when you compare the upper extremity to the lower extremity and the spine, the upper extremity has actually pretty small bones and pretty small muscles, and so and the reason for this is that the upper extremity usually isn't used for any kind of load bearing. Okay, and so by load bearing I mean bearing the weight of your body. So when you stand up, when you sit down, that's mostly your legs and your spine that's handling that. Your upper extremity is not really doing it; it's just kind of supporting yourself. Okay. And so if you compare kind of the analogous muscles of your upper extremity to the other parts, you'll see that they're a lot smaller, right? And so I think the best analogy that you can make is between your arm and your leg, right? And so they're both kind of similar in their structure in that there's an upper part, there's a lower part, and then you have kind of the ends with the hands and the feet. Okay. If you compare like the humerus bone, which is the bone in your upper arm, compared to your femur, which is your thigh bone, you'll see the femur is a lot thicker just because it has to, not only does it have to kind of propel you forward, but it has to kind of bear your weight as well. Whereas your arms, most of the time, they aren't really doing it. Okay. But because the upper extremity is kind of smaller, it's actually capable of a much wider range of motions and a lot wider range of controls. Okay. And so if you look at, let's say the shoulder joint. So the shoulder joint is something we talked about a couple of weeks ago. If your shoulder joint is one of the loosest and most flexible joints in your body, because your shoulder can do all different kinds of movements. Okay, but that also makes it a greater risk for injury. Okay, and your wrists and your fingers are probably some of the muscles in your body that you have the finest control over, right? And so if you think about probably everyone right now is writing in their notebooks or on their iPads with their hand, right? I think writing is something we kind of take for granted because it's something that a lot of us do every day. But it's actually a very fine-tuned movement. And so if you try to take your pencil and try to write with your foot, you'll probably find that it's almost impossible because writing is a very very delicate act. And if you think about it, if you think about concert musicians, they play fine instruments like violins. and flutes with their hands. You think of surgeons, and so they perform very delicate surgeries with their hands. And so, your hands are capable of very, very delicate things that I think a lot of us really take for granted. But it's not a trivial thing that your upper extremity. Okay, so let's take a look at the major bones in the upper extremity. Okay, and so we've gone over a lot of these before when we talk about bones, but it kind of bears repeating because we'll be focusing on them a lot over this week. Okay? And so I'm going to start kind of from the top and go down to your fingers, right? And so we're starting with the clavicle. So the clavicle is kind of this bone. Clavicle is this bone right here. And so the clavicle is kind of a very slender bone, and what it does is that it connects your sternum to your shoulder. Okay? And I think we mentioned before that your clavicle is often very often fractured because it's very exposed, and so you can just kind of touch kind of the top of your chest, and you can feel your clavicle right there. And that's not that common. So usually there's like a layer of fat or a layer of muscle that protects the bone, but the clavicle is just kind of standing out there. So, if you karate chop someone on their clavicles, you're probably going to fracture because it's so exposed. Okay. All right. So next we have the scapula. Actually. All right. So your scapula, it's you can't really see it that well in this figure, but it's kind of this kind of shoulder blade bone, and this kind of flat bone that's in the back right there. Okay. So that is your shoulder blade bone. And the main feature of the scapula is that it has this kind of small cavity called the glenoid cavity, which is what connects to your arm. Okay, and so the connection between the humerus and the scapula that forms your shoulder joint. All right, so next we have the humerus, and so the humerus is the upper arm bone. Okay, so you only have one. It's right here. Okay. And the main feature of the humerus is that it has this kind of small spherical head that kind of fits right into the scapula. And that kind of forms that kind of ball and socket joint there, which kind of gives your shoulder a very large range of motion. All right, so then we move on to the lower arm. And so the lower arm, we have two bones. And so we have the radius, which is this kind of smaller bone. And then we have the ulna, which is slightly bigger one right here. And so what you'll notice from the radius and the ulna is that, if you look at the radius, it has one kind of narrow end, right? Up here, the bone is very narrow. So even though technically it connects with the elbow, it doesn't really take part in the elbow joint all that much. But then it becomes much wider as you get to the wrist. Okay, and the ulna is just the opposite. So the ulna is very wide at your elbow and very narrow at the wrist. Okay, and so your elbow joint, for the most part, we say your elbow joint connects to your ulna. It doesn't really connect to the radius. And then your wrist joint is connecting to the radius, and not so much to the ulna. Okay, and then we go ahead and move down to the hand. So your hand is kind of made up of a series of lots of tiny bones. And so the first we have are the carpal bones. And so these are the bones that are connected directly to the wrist. Okay, and so there's kind of a small network of bones there. Next, we have the metacarpals, which are kind of your lower finger bones. Okay, and so these connect directly to the carpals and kind of form kind of the lower part of your fingers. And then at the very end of your fingers are your phalanges, which are the bones kind of at the very end of your hand. So your hand has a lot of bones, and like we mentioned before, your hand can do a lot of very fine movements, and part of that reason is because there's so many different bones, so you can kind of twist and contort your hands in lots of different ways. You can do lots of different kinds of movements. Okay. All right, and so that's a summary of the main bones of the upper extremity. So we'll be doing. When we're doing calculations, we're going to focus a lot on the elbow joint at first, just because the elbow is probably one of the more simpler joints in the body. We're going to do some on the shoulder as well, and the wrist. So those are the main primary joints that you can have a lot of control. All right, any questions on this so far? Okay, so let's look at the muscles in the upper extremity. Okay. So your muscles are, like I said, responsible for movement. And a lot of the calculations that we're going to be doing is going to be computing how much force do these muscles need to exert in order to carry out kind of basic tasks? Okay. All right, so just like before, we're going to start kind of in the shoulder and kind of the chest and back area, and then kind of work our way towards, towards the arm or towards the hands. All right, so let's look at the first muscle here, the deltoid. And so the deltoid is the muscle that's kind of right on the outside of your shoulder. Okay. And so that's the one, if you feel your shoulder right here, that's your main muscle, that's your deltoid. Okay. Next, we have the pectoralis, and so the pectoralis is a collection of muscles that are in your chest. Okay, and so probably people usually refer to them as the pecs. Okay, so your pecs are kind of right here, right on your chest. Okay. Your pecs are mostly there it's partly there to protect your ribs, but it's also kind of helps with pushing motions. That's what we're talking about. Okay. All right, next we have the latissimus dorsi, and so these are kind of more casually referred to as the lats. And so we can't really see it here, but your latissimus dorsi are kind of your upper back muscles. And so they're almost kind of right behind the pecs. Right? And so they're kind of right behind here. Okay? So it's kind of in your upper back. Okay. All right, next we have the muscles in your arms. And so I guess we don't I don't have anything past the elbow. But your upper arm kind of has quite a few muscles that are there. So the first one, I think the one that people associate most with like Popeye and things like that, is your biceps brachii. Okay, so that's the muscle kind of right on the top of your upper arm. So this is the biceps brachii right here. Okay. When I was little, I thought the biceps was, just because I watched a lot of cartoons growing up, and so I always saw Popeye with the huge, biceps. And so I would do bicep curls with like water bottle. I was like 8 years old. Okay, so that's the bicep brachii. Next, we have the brachialis, and so the brachialis is almost parallel to the biceps brachii. So it's responsible for the same movements, but it's technically a separate muscle. So the brachialis, it's a little bit hard to see, but it kind of goes right underneath the biceps brachii. So it kind of starts here, it kind of runs up there. Okay. And then we also have the brachialis, which is another one as well. Excuse me, the brachioradialis. I do put that. So the brachioradialis is your forearm muscle. So that's the main muscle in your lower forearm, and that's mostly used for kind of grip strength. That's the muscle that's here, and it kind of runs down your lower arm, just like that. All right, and then finally we have the triceps. So I think this is probably a good image of the triceps. So the triceps are the muscles in the back of your upper arm, and those are mostly responsible for elbow flexion, any kind of pushing, any kind of activity that pushes stuff. Okay. And so those are the main muscles that we'll focus on. And so, at least one of these is going to come up in the lectures or in the homeworks. Okay. Any questions on these muscles here? Okay. Let's look at the joints. And so, we've already kind of talked about these a little bit, but, we'll kind of repeat them here again, just for completeness. Okay. So we have the shoulder joint. And so the shoulder joint is the joint between your humerus and your scapula. Okay. And so this is a ball and socket joint, just as we mentioned, because your shoulder is capable of a wide range of motions. Okay. But because it's so flexible, it's very commonly subjected to dislocations. Next, we have the elbow joint, and so that's the joint between the humerus and the ulna. And so this is primarily a hinge joint, and it's primarily used for kind of elbow flexion and extension. All right, next we have the wrist joint, and so the wrist joint is the joint in your wrist, and so it's primarily a hinge joint, but it is also capable of kind of lateral movements as well. But for the most part, we kind of associate it with as a hinge. And then we have all the joints between your hand bones and the fingers. Okay. So these joints, even though there is movement in between them, it's primarily sliding movements to kind of just so that you can kind of contort your hand in lots of different ways. We're not going to focus too much on the hand, just because with so many bones and so many joints in there, it gets a little bit complicated. But there is a lot of muscles and a lot of joints and bones in the hands. Okay. And so what we're going to do, kind of right after this slide, I think, right after this slide is, we're going to start to do biomechanical analysis. Okay. In particular, we're going to look at static analysis. Okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at the human body in certain kinds of positions like this. And, we're going to be basically exerting external loads on the human body. Okay. And so these loads would be, maybe you're carrying something, maybe you're pushing off against something, maybe you're supporting yourself in a certain way, whatever. And so any kind of external loads and very kind of typical situations. Okay. And what we're usually interested in biomechanical analysis is we want to find out how much force the muscles have to exert in order to maintain the body in this position. Okay. Because a lot of times, your bones aren't going to, just because your bones are kind of static objects, they're not able to kind of maintain your body. Your muscles have to exert some force in order to maintain that position. Okay. But of course, this, whenever your muscles act, and kind of as a result of external forces as well, it's going to put some forces at your joints. And so we call those reaction forces. Okay. And so that's also going to be important to talk about, because there are a lot of issues associated with joints. And so things like sprains, dislocations, arthritis, those are all diseases at the joint or conditions at the joint. So finding out how much force is exerted there is another important point. And so whenever whenever we're doing biomechanical analysis, those are the two things we're most interested in. Is, how much force is the muscle exerting, and what kind of reaction forces are we getting at the joints? And then what we can do from there is we can take that information, take that analysis, and then put that forward to say that maybe this person needs needs some kind of brace, maybe this person needs surgery, this person is going to be put himself at risk of injury if he does this. Okay, and there's a lot of information that we can. Okay. All right. Any questions on this before we jump into the calculations? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. Okay. So let's start doing some upper extremity biomechanics. Question. So do we consider joint friction while modeling problems? That's a good question. So actually we're going to ignore that for now. And so for the most part, for a relatively healthy person, the joints are pretty well lubricated. And of course, that tends to deteriorate as the person gets older. And so, that does become an issue for some people. But for now, we're just going to assume that we have frictionless joints. Okay. Let me just reiterate this point here. And so when we're performing static biomechanical analysis, we're primarily interested in computing muscle forces and joint reaction forces. And we're going to do this through a kind of a very standard kind of free body diagram, force balancing, moment balancing, things like that. All right, so let's just kind of jump right into it. And so, last Wednesday, we reviewed a lot of these mechanics stuff. Okay? And so now we can just start to apply. All right, so let's consider the elbow joint at first. So let's consider the elbow joint held at 90 degrees of flexion. Image of this, let's say it looks like something like this. So you have a person, they're kind of holding their arm in kind of a 90-degree angle. Okay. And let's say that this person is supporting a weight. Okay. So they're holding something in their. So typically what I like to do in these problems is I like to draw kind of the bones as kind of just rods, okay? Kind of simple simplicity. And so here we have the upper arm. Here we have the lower arm. And then on this diagram here, we're going to draw all the forces that are acting on this system. And so at the very least, we know that there is a vertical weight. Okay. And so the weight is going to have a magnitude of W. Okay. We're going to solve this problem with just variables first, just because we're going to look at the result and we can kind of see how the different factors how they affect our result. Okay, but don't worry, we'll plug in typical values at the end. All right. Next thing we're going to consider is we're going to consider the weight of the lower arm itself. Okay. And so not only is this person holding a weight, but then the lower arm, the bones, the muscles, the tissues in the lower arm, they all have weight. Okay. Okay, so we'll call that WA. Actually, let me label these. So W, external, hands. Okay, combined weight of the lower arm. And so, of course, technically the weight of the lower arm is distributed throughout the entire lower arm. But just for simplicity, we're going to assume just a single force vector acting at the centroid, or the center of mass of the lower arm. Okay. All right, and so opposing these weights are going to be muscle force. We'll call that FM. And we'll just consider one muscle at this point. So we're going to say this is the muscle force from the biceps brachii. And then we also have two joint reactions as well. And so the joint reactions, usually the way I do them is I like to kind of split them up into their two components. Okay. Because a lot of times, when you're looking at the anatomy of a person's body, you can kind of tell which direction the force is going, because the force is just going to go in the direction parallel to the fibers. Okay. And so usually we know ahead of time the direction that FM is going. But for the joint reactions, we don't know kind of beforehand what direction the joint reactions go. And so we have to kind of be as general as we can. And so I'm going to draw one reaction force in the X direction. So we'll call that JX. Another reaction force in the Y direction, we'll call that JY. JX, joint reaction force in the X direction. Y. And once again, I break this up because, hard to assume Right. So, we split the joint reactions up into two because, we don't know what direction they're going to be. Okay. All right, question from the chat. And so will the locations of points at which the muscle arm force act always be provided? What is a suitable assumed location in case it is provided? So for this class, for the calculations we're doing, for the vast majority of the time, I am going to give that to you. But where you can kind of compute that if it's not given to you, most of the time you can assume that it acts at the centroid of whatever body segment that you're considering. And so, not all body segments are perfectly symmetrical, but they're mostly fairly close. And so if you kind of just measure the length, in this case, if you measure the length of the lower arm and you kind of just stick the force vector right in the middle of that, that's usually not a bad assumption, right? Or you're not going to be that far off. But for this case, I am going to give that to you. Yeah. Oh, and one other thing that we'll talk about is I'll talk about this. Okay. Is with regards to where the muscle is. Okay, so those are all of our unknowns, or those are all of our variables in this case. Okay, and so out of these variables, the ones that are typically unknown are going to be, like I mentioned, the muscle force and the joint reaction forces. Okay, and so the ones we're going to be looking for are going to be FM, that's what we're going to solve for, JX, and JY. Okay. So everything I circled there, those are going to be the unknowns in our problem. So before we start solving, kind of in relation to Anika's question, is that we need to have some geometrical information here. Okay. And so the vast majority of the time, I'm going to give you the length of the of whatever segment that we're looking at. Okay. And so these figures always get really messy. Best. Actually, let me label it on this one. Okay, and so we're going to assume that the entire length of the lower arm is going to be LA. Okay. And then the midpoint, which is where the weight of the arm is acting, we'll assume this is LA divided by 2. And so we're just going to assume it's just kind of halfway up, halfway up. Okay. The other geometrical information we need is we need to know how far the muscle force is acting away from the joint. Okay. Right, and so we need this distance right here. Okay. So between the elbow joint and where the FM vector is. So I'll call that LM. Okay. And then we also need directions for all of these vectors as well. And so just for this problem, just to keep things simple, we're going to assume everything is at a 90-degree. Okay, so FM points vertically up, WA points vertically down, and the weight points vertically down. That's right. All right. And so what we're going to do next here is we're going to perform just a very simple force balance. So we're going to sum up all the forces in the X direction, sum up all the forces in the Y direction, sum up the moments. set them all equal to 0 because we have a static situation, and then we use those three equations to solve for Fm, Jx, and Jy. All right, any questions on this? Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and perform our force balances. All right, and so this is going to give us three equations that we can solve for our unknown. All right, so let's start with something simple. So let's start with the sum of the forces in the x direction. Okay, and so we're going to take all the forces that are pointing in the horizontal direction and sum them up. Okay, and so if we go back to the free body diagram here, and we're going to look at, so we have 5 forces here, right? So we have Jx, Jy, Fm, Wa, and W. Okay, so we're going to look for which ones point in the x direction. So we're going to look, there's only one. So it's only Jx. And in order to have a static situation, then this has to equal 0. Okay. So that actually solves for one of our unknowns right off the bat. So we can say, or we can conclude that under this configuration, there is no horizontal reaction force at the joint. All right, so let's sum up the forces in the y direction. So remember, not only do you have to sum up the forces in that direction, but you have to give it the appropriate sign. Okay. And so our remaining 4 forces are going to go in this equation. So we have Jy, we have Fm. Both of these are pointing vertically upward, and so they're going to have a positive sign. And then we have Wa and
What about the joint force? You're just guessing the direction, right?
So the joint force we split up into 2 components, and so the direction that's going to end up in the end is going to be the sum of those 2 components.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there will be times. Well, in this case, we probably could have concluded from the beginning that Jx would be 0, but in other times when the forces are in kind of oblique directions, then we'll compute both Fx or Jx and Jy, and then those two combined will give us the direction. Okay. So we have this equation here. So we can't solve this because it has 2 of our unknowns. So both Jy and Fm are still unknown. And so now we're going to sum up the moments. Okay. And so when you sum up the moments, you always have to have a reference point. You have to always have to have a point in which you're summing up the moments. Okay. And so 99% of the time in these problems, the best place to sum the moments around is the joint itself that you're considering. Okay. Okay. Because usually when I give you measurements in these problems, those measurements are always relative to the particular joint. Okay. And so in this case, the joint that we're summing around is going to be the elbow joint. Okay. And so let's go ahead and sum this up. So this is actually pretty straightforward. And so we have 3 forces here that are going to contribute to the moment. Okay. And so one benefit of summing up the moments around the joint is that your joint reaction forces, Jx and Jy, are not going to contribute to this moment. Okay. So Jx and Jy aren't here because the distance between the Jx and Jy and the elbow joint is 0. Okay. All right. And so let's go ahead and compute the rest of it. So we have the moment as a result of the muscle force. And so that's going to be the product of Fm and Lm. Then we have the moment as a result of the weight of the arm. So that's going to be Wa multiplied by its distance, which is La divided by 2. And then we have our moment from our external weight, W, and it is acting a length of LA away from the L. So it's going to be W times LA. Equals 0. Okay. And so, of course, we need to put signs in all these terms. And so we need to look and see which direction those moments are going to be acting relative to the joint. Okay. And so this FM, if we kind of follow this around, we can see that this is a counterclockwise moment. Okay. Whereas WA and W, these are all going to act in a clockwise direction. So that means our FM, LM is going to be positive, but our moment due to WA and W are both going to be negative. All right. So fairly straightforward, and so hopefully this was fairly easy to follow. And so let's go ahead and take these equations and solve for our unknowns. Okay. All right. And so if you'll notice in our last equation here, the moment equation, there's only one unknown in this equation. So that's FM. So let's go ahead and solve this equation for FM. We have FM is equal to, and I'm just gonna kind of do the algebra. WA, LA. 2, it's W, A, all divided by plus. Sorry. So WALA divided by 2 plus WLA, all divided by L. All right. So remember, FM here represents the muscle force that the biceps brachii must exert in order to maintain this position. Okay. All right, and so let's examine each of the terms in this expression here, and let's see how they affect the amount of muscle force that we must exert. Okay. All right. So let's start with something simple. Okay, so let's look at our two weights. Let's see if WA and W, both of these are in the numerator of our expression. Okay. And so what we can say is as W and WA increase in magnitude, and so as the person, holds, a larger amount of weight, maybe their arm weighs more, okay? As W and WA increase in magnitude, then FM also has to increase in magnitude in order to maintain static equilibrium. So that makes sense, right? And so if you hold a heavier weight, then your muscles have to do more work in order to support that weight, right? So that's pretty straight. Let's look at the other things that are in the numerator. Right, we have the length of the arm. And so these are going to be the same thing. And so as the length of the arm increases, then the muscle force must also increase. So that point right there actually gives us a very interesting conclusion, a very interesting observation. So what this is telling us that people with longer arms, or just just larger people in general have to exert more muscle force to kind of carry the same load as person with short arms. Okay. So that's why in general, people say don't pick a fight with someone that's bigger than you because they have a bigger body and longer arms, their muscles are naturally going to be stronger because they have to exert more force to do kind of the same things that they do. So if you get into a fight with them, you're probably not going to win. All right, question in the chat. Question. So don't longer limbs also imply a further point of muscle attachment, bigger LM? Not necessarily. And so actually, we're just going to talk about that. So your muscle attachment length LM actually is there's some correlation with height and with kind of the general size of the person, but not always. So you'll see people with a larger LM that's kind of much smaller in stature. So there's some correlation, but it's not as strong as so LM, so LA. So the question is, how correlated are LA and LM? And so are these two typically proportional? So not always. And so there's some correlation, but not necessarily. All right. And so that actually brings me to my last point. And so your muscle attachment length, LM, and so let's look at this equation here and look at the effect as LM increases. Okay. And so as your muscle attachment distance increases, then that actually decreases the amount of force that your arm has to receive. Because ln is in the denominator of our expression. So I think this last point here, I think is the most interesting because, generally speaking, when we perform a task, any kind of task, we want to do it with the least amount of work or the least amount of exertion as possible. Okay. But if you look at the way, the human body is designed, what you're going to see basically everywhere is that your muscles attach very, very close to the joints in almost all cases. Okay. Okay. And so you're going to see once we actually plug in numbers that, because of this, because your muscle attachment is so close, even just to kind of carry a very light amount of load, your muscles are actually exerting many, many times that in tension, just to maintain that load because that attachment distance is so small. And so when you think about it, that kind of seems like a mistake, right? And so you would think, why weren't we kind of designed in a way so that our muscles attach further away from the joint? Because that would give us more mechanical advantage for our muscles. Yep. So and it's already kind of stealing my thunder. So yeah, part of it has to do with speed, and I'll kind of give you that analogy in a second. All right. So to kind of illustrate this, let me kind of draw you an analogy. Okay. And so, another one kind of way that you can kind of model your elbow joint is with a drawbridge. So if you're kind of familiar with any kind of medieval setting or castles and stuff like that, you're probably familiar with the concept of, you have a bridge here. Usually it's over a moat or some water, and there's like some alligators in the water. I'm going to draw an alligator, but no alligator. Okay. And so to open and close the gate, the gate kind of swings on a hinge, like right here, okay? And so to pull it up, there's usually some kind of string or some kind of chain attached to the drawbridge, kind of like this, okay? Right, and then to pull the bridge up, you would have people, probably the peasants of the village or something like that, kind of pull on the cord, this, okay? And then as that cord kind of shortens in length, then it pulls the bridge. Okay. All right. And so kind of the design that I've drawn you right here is a case where, the drawbridge, which is the string here, kind of represents your muscle. And since this is attached far away from the joint, we have a very large LN, or very large attachment distance. And so if you were to kind of wanted to pull this up, right? And we use our formula from up here to kind of compute how much force that would take, because Lm would be so large in that case, we wouldn't require that much work. So maybe you can do this task with, maybe just 2 or 3 peasants. Okay. All right, but what are the downsides of this? Okay. Even though it wouldn't require a lot of force, it would take a long time, or in other words, it'd be really slow to pull the bridge up. Okay. And the reason for that is actually quite simple. Okay. And so in order to kind of reach that far away from the joint, you'll see that this string right here is very, very long. And so in order to actually pull it up, you'd have to kind of pull a lot of string in order to get it up, just because the arc, or this distance from here to here, is very, very long, okay? And so even though it wouldn't require a lot of force, you'd kind of be sitting there pulling rope for a long time to pull the bridge up, okay? And so if we looked at another design, and so let's say that we had another drawbridge here, okay? And then let's say that we pulled from right here, okay? Again, we had some peasants. You guys this time, okay? And so in this case, and if we measured Lm, this would be much smaller. And so with the smaller LM, of course, this is going to require a lot more fluids. Because that moment arm between the cable and the joint is much smaller. But the benefit here is that if you had to pull up the bridge in a hurry, you'd be able to do that much faster. So let's look at the same thing we did for the other cases. So let's look at the kind of the arc or the distance that you have to travel from here to here. And so that point at which the muscle is attached only has to travel that much distance to kind of go up. Okay. And so that is a lot smaller. And so if you had to kind of pull up the bridge in a hurry, it would require more peasants. And so maybe you, instead of 2 or 3 peasants, maybe you get, 10 or 11 peasants, right? In order to get the force necessary. But with all those peasants kind of pulling together, you'd be able to pull up the bridge much faster. And generally speaking, being able to move your limbs quicker and have you kind of go through your whole range of motion in a shorter period of time, generally that was more kind of advantageous for humans as they kind of evolved and kind of survived the wilderness and things like that. And so, one thing you can argue is that, from a biomechanics standpoint, our muscles kind of have developed in a certain way to kind of, allow us to do this kind of behavior. Okay. Because if we kind of evolved in a different way where our muscles kind of attach kind of further away from the joint, then yeah, we'd be able to perform tasks, without our muscles really having to exert much work. But, that comes at a cost of, being able to move our limbs faster. Okay. And so if you can imagine, your ancestors, surviving out in the wilderness, being chased by a bear, they're probably a lot more thankful that they have short muscle attachments rather than long ones, right? Otherwise, they're not outrunning that bear. Okay, and so this will be kind of a common theme, throughout, these next 3 weeks is that, when we kind of do these biomechanical analyses, you'll see that, whatever external forces or weights that we're going to assume, they're going to be much farther away from the joint than the muscle that we're examining. And so, that's going to have this kind of amplified effect. The muscle force is going to be much greater than whatever force that we're. That's going to be particularly relevant in spinal biomechanics because, spine and posture, I think, is not something people think about a lot. And so, if you're slouching, you may not really think much of it. But in reality, you're putting your lower back under a lot of stress because, your back muscle, your spinal erectors have such a tiny kind of attachment distance. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So that's the muscle force, and so that's the formula that we can use to compute that. We do have one more unknown, so let's go ahead and compute the joint reaction force. Okay. And so to compute the joint reaction force, we only had one, which was JY. So let's go back to our some of the forces in the Y direction. Okay. And so in this one, we had JY plus FM minus W minus WA equal to 0. Okay. And so this tells us that JY equal to W plus WA minus FM. And then of course we can plug in our answer for FM. So W and WA are both known in this problem. And so we plug in WFM here. We get WA, LA divided by 2 plus WLA divided by L. Okay, so let's so last thing I want to do here is let's go ahead and plug in some typical numbers just so that you can get a sense of the values for these things. Okay. We have WA. WA is equal to 20 newtons. Okay. Remember, WA is the weight of the arm. Let's say that the weight that we're carrying in the hand is just 80 newtons, so that's very, very light. So I think that's should be only be like less than 20 pounds. Okay. We'll say LM is 4 centimeters. LA is 15 centimeters. And oh, sorry, we'll say LA. Let's write that. So LA is 30 centimeters. And so LA divided by 2 is 15 centimeters. Okay. All right, so let's plug these in and let's compute the values for 2 unknowns. So first we have FM, and so we plug in, we get about 750 newtons. JY, we have minus 650. All right, and so if you compare this, compare this to the external load. And so in this case, we're carrying an external load of 80 newtons, right? And so in order to support that, our biceps muscle has to exert a force that's almost 10 times that amount. Right? So that's about 750 newtons, okay? Of course, we don't think about this. We don't really feel it because, our muscles just kind of do this automatically. But if you actually, put a force meter on your muscles, you'll see that the muscle forces are actually quite high. Okay. All right. Any questions on this example here? Okay. All right. So that was our first example. Okay. Probably probably a lot more to discuss than you thought from such a simple free body diagram. But I think this example kind of highlights a lot of kind of really interesting trends that you see in the muscles and the joints. Okay. All right. So let's do another example. We're gonna stay at the elbow joint, but we're gonna bring up kind of an important issue with this this next example. Okay. All right, so kind of most importantly, the last example that we did made a lot of assumptions in terms of the geometry of where the muscle attaches, and we also made the assumption that there's only one muscle that's supporting this action. So in that last example, we assume that FM pointed vertically upwards, just kind of for the sake of convenience. Okay. And the other assumption is that we only assumed one muscle force was supporting the action. Okay. In reality, there are hundreds of muscles in your body, and there is a lot of redundancy in terms of the actions that they perform. Okay. And so a lot of times, when you perform an action, even something that's very simple like carrying load, there's usually several different muscles that are supporting that action, and it's not all just put on one. And the elbow joint is actually a great example of this. So if you recall from the summary of the muscles that we talked about earlier, there are quite a few muscles that are in your arms that support flexion at the elbow and flexion at the wrist. And so let's see how we can kind of account for these all at the same time. All right, and so our geometry for this example is going to be very similar to the last example. And so we're going to have an elbow at 90 degrees. So I drew the lower arm a little bit longer in this case, just because we're going to have several things going on here. Okay. But just like the last example, we're going to assume that we're holding a weight in our hand. All right. So just like the last example, we're going to have several different. We're going to have muscle forces here. Okay. But instead of pointing vertically upwards, and so instead I'm going to point it at an angle. So this is a little bit more realistic. Okay. And so you're going to have there's some angulation to the muscle. And so we're going to assume that muscle attaches at an angle of theta m, okay, which is somewhere between 0 and 90. And so in green right here, we'll say that this is the muscle force from the biceps brachii. Okay. So that's the same as before, except with an angle now. It's not at 90 degrees. All right, let's add another muscle force. So in addition to the biceps brachii, we also talked about a muscle called the brachialis. Okay. We're going to assume that brachialis kind of attaches here. We'll call this FM2. And it's going to have its own attachment angle. And we kind of draw just, it usually doesn't attach this far away, but I'm just drawing it further away just for legibility. We'll call this FM2. We'll say that it has an attachment angle of theta M2. Okay. So that's the muscle force from the brachialis. So remember, the brachialis was the muscle that kind of runs. It's almost parallel to the biceps brachii, except it kind of runs underneath it. So, for a simple elbow flexion like this, you can say that both muscles are kind of supporting it. But in reality, they have kind of subtle differences in the actions that they perform. All right, and then let's also put in one more muscle force here. So let me put it in pink. And again, I'm just exaggerating just to kind of make sure you can read it all. We'll call this FM3, and then we'll say that it catches at an angle theta M3. And this force right here is coming from the brachioradialis. Okay. And so just because it's going to get a little bit messy, I'm going to go ahead and draw another figure here, because we also need their distances. And so let me use kind of the same color scheme that I used there. And so we're going to say that we're going to have a green dot here. Let me call the biceps brachii force. We'll call that FM1 and theta M1. So you have a point where the first multiple force attaches FM2, and then pink FM3. All right, and so we're given all three of those lengths. So we'll say that FM1, and so this is the elbow joint here on the left. Okay, so everything is going to be measured relative to that elbow joint. The distance between the elbow joint and FM1, we'll call this LM1. The distance between the elbow joint and FM2, we'll call it LM2. And the distance between the elbow joint and FM3, we'll call it L. Okay. So all the attachment distances are going to be given to us in this problem. All right. In addition to all those parameters there, we're also given some information about the geometry of the arm itself. And so we'll say that the arm has a total length of, we'll call it LA again. And so the distance, so what that means is the distance between the elbow joint and where the external weight is acting is LA. We're also going to assume that the arm itself has its own weight, okay? And so just like in the first example, we'll call this WA. And we're going to assume that this acts halfway up the arm. So it's not part of that image there, those images up there, just because I think it'll make it a little bit messy, but you know, we have those as well. Okay. Also, just like the first example, we're interested in the reaction forces at the elbow joint. So this is JX and J. All right. So a lot of information here. And so what do we want to find? All right, and so in this problem, what we're interested in is we're going to compute all three of the muscle forces So it's FM1, FM2, FM3, okay? As well as the two joint reaction forces, JX and JY. So in total, we have five variables that we need to solve for, 5 unknowns. Three muscle forces and two joint reactions. Quite a lot of setup for this one. A lot of drawing. So I appreciate you guys hanging in there, especially so close to the end of class. Okay. So of course we're not gonna have enough time to solve this today. We're just at the end of class, but I do want to kind of motivate you guys. And so we'll kind of leave this at a cliffhanger. Right? We have 5 unknowns. Okay. And so that kind of implies that we need 5 equations to solve this. Okay. And so we're going to go about solving this the same way we did before. So we're going to take our force balance. We're going to sum up the forces in the x direction, set equal to 0. We're going to sum up the forces in the y direction equal to 0. And we're going to sum up the moments around the elbow joint and set that equal to 0 as well. Okay. So this gives us 1, 2, 3 equations. That's the problem, right? And so as it stands right now, we're not going to be able to solve for all of the unknowns. So we're gonna need to bring in some additional data and some additional equations in order to give us that extra 2 equations that we can solve. And we're going to rely on more symmetric data. You kind of remember that. Okay. But we'll do that kind of in detail next time. Are there any final questions on any of this before we wrap it up for today? Okay, all right, so that's all we got time for today. So thank you guys for coming. So hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you guys on Wednesday. Question: the homework to do Friday? Yes, and so you should be actually after Wednesday, you should be able to do everything. Be able to Thanks, guys. Okay. Surgery or wait until I have time to surgery. I'm gonna do PT tomorrow morning. Oh, get my range of motion back so I can live around. Surgery like the summer. I don't run. Okay. First of all, of course. He uses some shot. I just messed up. Huh? I think I did it 3 times for actually, no, I think I just did. I didn't even have a calculator. But anyway, I put it back on. I took it out during the summer and I just didn't put it back on. And then I was like, oh crap, calculator. Did you go out? You said the number doesn't matter. It says it was just the way you did the phone. It was all about the setup, right? Zoom, any final questions before I wrap it up?